Dank u, meneer Van Rijn, voor de inleiding. Ladies and gentlemen, a pleasure to be here this morning with you and to talk a bit about what's next for the Netherlands. I am an historian, and that means when we talk about the future, we have to talk about the past. And via that way, I hope to enter into discussion with you about the state of the Netherlands and how this ties into you. Theme of today, as it's become inescapably known to you, is the Grand Tour. And the Grand Tour was, in fact, as indicated, begun in the late Middle Ages and lasted until about the age of the steam engine, when railways and steamships made travel very different from what it had been before, revolutionized it, democratized it. But the tour, the aim of the Grand Tour, at least in the Western European context, was always from the northern parts of Europe, and Britons in particular were active in sending aristocratic children, men chiefly, down to the southern climes of the continent and Italy in particular, because it was in Italy where you really had your experience, where you really picked up the knowledge that was necessary. There were all kinds of people who did this. Most famous of them, in fact, was this person, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who, in fact, made up his diary, had written diaries in the 1780s, and then whipped that up into a publication called Italian Journey in about 1818. Goethe was in some ways not representative of what happened the Grand Tour. He was well into his 30s when he made the travel to Italy, and usually it was young men of 17, 18, 19-year-old who made this trip down to the continent. But he, in fact, gave the most memorable account of what a young man could expect down in Italy and why Italy was such a fantastic place to be. But of course there were others who did this as well. Certainly also in this country, thousands of people also embarked upon this journey. Perhaps the best known and most influential of these was P.C. Hooft. Just around the corner is a street named after him. P.C. Hooft, man of letters, also known for essentially having a kind of a circle of artists and intellectuals at his home in Muiderslot, just a few kilometers away from here. But somebody who, in fact, was seized by the Renaissance idea, by the Renaissance vision, by Renaissance aesthetics. This is something that he took from Italy when he went there at 17 years of age. The purpose of the Grand Tour, already indicated just a few minutes ago, but I'll simply say it as I see it here, to satisfy curiosity and learning, very, very broad aim, but also to promote cultural formation, that really the people who went there were to be transformed through formation, encounters with culture. Now that meant, especially in the 17th and 18th century, interactions with the legacy of Greece and particularly of Rome. Antiquity and how that inspired people, that's what mattered most to them. So in that sense, it had a very, very specific focus point for most of the people who went there. And that's why, of course, Italy mattered more than anywhere else. And, of course, the purpose was, and again, I think that's important, that's something that carries over to today, to prepare future leaders for important roles in politics and society. If you didn't speak French, if you didn't know about art, then you were unfit to lead the country and to lead society. Now, the Grand Tour could have other aims, as Samuel Johnson, 18th century wit, man of letters, also noted. If a young man is wild and must run after women in bad company, it is better this should be done abroad. Now, I'm not saying South African swimming pools is the modern variation of that, but obviously there is something to be said that Grand Tours can have different kinds of effects. And I think more generally speaking, Grand Tours did not per se make the world a better place. It was reserved for a very, very small subsegment of the general population. It was for an exclusive breed of people. And it was also designed to keep those people in place. This was about creating an elite that was essentially also inaccessible to the rest of the population. And more generally, I think this is something that we all struggle with as people in education, is that knowing things does not necessarily make people better, wiser, kinder. And in some ways, this was really, in this respect, but an aesthetic experience. It wasn't necessarily about moral transformation. It wasn't essentially about making the world in general a better place. In that sense, we can say that the aims were, of quite narrow. Now, this is, of course, one of the problems we have. It was Aristotle's, the Greek philosopher's critique on another Greek philosopher, Plato, that simply, essentially, bringing people in contact with knowledge, with philosophy, doesn't necessarily make them wise people. And I think we can make a parallel with the Dutch situation, with their encounter with tolerance. The presence of a pluralist society, that is to say, a very diverse society, people with different convictions, as the Netherlands has undoubtedly been in the last 500 years, does not mean that this society has always been up to meeting the challenges of encountering and dealing with that diversity. And I think the Dutch past and present illustrates this point. This is something I wanted to emphasize as an historian of the Netherlands at the University of Amsterdam. I discussed this with students. What is the history of this tolerance in the Netherlands? Because there is, of course, a very strong and powerful self-image associated with it. And, of course, this, and certainly I see this back in hundreds of exams that I grade in the history class on the Dutch past, is that it's really grounded in trade. This is the basis for Dutch tolerance. It reflects the international orientation of the Dutch. It means that the Dutch come into contact with many kinds of people in many different settings and therefore learn to deal with difference simply by encountering people in other parts of the world. And that this, in fact, serves as a kind of a bedrock, maybe even a guarantee for Dutch tolerance. And this would be seen then in all kinds of ways. This is a painting from the Rijksmuseum by Rembrandt van Rijn, painted around 1662. And it is the syndics of the Drapers Guild, better known to the Dutch as the Staalmeesters. And this is essentially used to illustrate that the Netherlands was, in fact, a very tolerant country. That this was a place with people of different faiths, through trade, you can say through commerce, essentially learn to deal with each other in ways that was good for everyone. You see here, there's a servant in the background, but you see here five Staalmeesters, and there are two Roman Catholics. There is a remonstrant, a doopsgezinde, or a Mennonite, and also a Calvinist. And you can't tell who's who because they are, in effect, equals here doing business with each other and growing wealthy together, respective of faith. So trade makes the Dutch tolerant. And also, pluralism also forced the Dutch to be tolerant. This is, in fact, a religiously divided land historically. You see here, just for, this is a map of the population in 1849, but this essentially reflects a much older pattern going back to the Dutch Republic. The green on the south is where there's an overwhelmingly Catholic majority, and the red in the north, stretching from Zeeland all the way in the southwest up to Groningen in the northeast, is essentially the Protestant belt. In some ways, this understates the religious diversity because Protestants were divided among themselves. So a very, very diverse country. And because this is a diverse country, as a couple of historians have said, this is a country with more religious diversity per square kilometer than anywhere else in the world. That this essentially is what forced the Dutch to become tolerant and deal with each other. And in some ways, this is, of course, true. You can see it also in a beautiful way in what happened in Maastricht. When this city was seized by Dutch forces in 1632, immediately it was arranged that the Catholics would also have to cede ground to the Protestants, but that the Catholics would themselves retain rights over public worship. So right next to each other, the church on the left, the Sint-Jan, became the Protestant church, and the Sint-Servaas, there on the right, that remained the Roman Catholic Church. And so you had public freedom for both faiths. Yet, as many of you know, this was exceptional. This was not true in most parts of the Republic. This was more typical of most parts of the Republic. And this, of course, is Onze Lieve Heer op Zolder. This is a schuilkerk, a church that was essentially not supposed to look like a church. This was for Roman Catholics. It looks like a house, but inside there is a chapel. Again, just a few hundred meters away from here, I guess from here about 1.5 kilometers. But at any rate, you see here a house that must not look like a church. Everybody knew Catholics worshiped there, but Catholics were not allowed to publicly profess their faith. Now, one of the questions, of course, is that this is often seen as an example of tolerance. This is a case of where a Protestant majority allows a Catholic minority to practice its faith. But you could just as well say this is an example of intolerance, because Catholics are not openly allowed to express their faith. And I think that's something that is also important to note, that you can be seen as both. Also, you can see here, Jews were allowed in Amsterdam to build their public buildings. This was a synagogue built in the end of the 17th century for the Portuguese. And this is, in fact, an example of, again, Dutch tolerance. But the Jews were allowed to build there because they were seen as a foreign nation. And in many ways, there were other kinds of restrictions on this foreign nation. And indeed, Amsterdam was relatively unique in giving them as much freedom in the Republic as they received. There were towns and regions in the Republic where the Jews were not allowed to settle. So there were also limits, clearly, on Dutch toleration. And going back to trade, one of the things I think that's very important to say is that often there's this notion that trade and the Dutch need for trade promotes peace and it promotes tolerance. But of course, it's important to note that trade could also bring anything but tolerance and peace. The most infamous example, perhaps, from early modern times is the Bande massacre by Jan Pieterszoon Koen, who led this and essentially resulted in the massacre of a whole island in order to secure the nutmeg or the nootmuskaat trade. Also an example, you can sort of say, the VOC mentaliteit also brought that about. So always tying in trade with tolerance and peace, I think, is problematic. I think for some people that's self-evident, but with the Dutch self-image, that is not always that self-evident. And even in modern times, or more modern times, you can say that intolerance has been an integral part of Dutch history. The first Dutch king, Willem I, in fact, provoked a confrontation with the southern part of the Netherlands. Belgium was, for a time, part of the Netherlands, by essentially antagonizing, making it difficult for Roman Catholics, particularly in the southern part of the country. He wanted to restrict the rights of the Roman Catholic Church. And that's one very important reason why there was a Belgian revolution that resulted in the separation of Belgium from the Netherlands. So also here, you can speak of a kind of intolerance. And of course, also domestically, this was sometimes not much better. The Dutch lived and died apart. This is a nice photo of two tombstones in two different cemeteries in Roermond, in the southern part. And what we see here in the front is the headstone of a Protestant officer buried in the Protestant cemetery, and then his Catholic wife is buried beyond the wall in the Catholic cemetery. Of course, in this case, it's nice. You had an advantage at least of having a little bit of status, a little bit of money, that you could essentially still be joined in death by having two hands connect across the wall. So in that sense, in this respect, both separated and united in death. But most people, of course, had to live on one side of the wall or the other, and also die on one side of the wall or the other. My point here simply is that peace and tolerance are not self-evident parts of a kind of Dutch DNA. It's often professed, it's often proclaimed, and I think a little bit too easily compared to if you take a look at Dutch history. The trade could be rapacious, I could say it could be very hard, it could be very intolerant, certainly toward groups outside the Netherlands. And internal differences, the domestic differences between the Dutch themselves also could be likewise irreconcilable, very, very hard to sort out. What we can say maybe that the Dutch were good at least within the confines of their own country, was tolerance in its original sense of the term, of enduring the unendurable, of tolerating what is actually intolerable. The Dutch did not, in fact, murder each other in a massive way, at least not after the beginning of the 80 Years' War. They learned a kind of modus vivendi of getting along with each other without too much domestic tensions and violence. And yet, again, it's primarily about enduring what people actually find despicable, find very, very problematic. It is certainly not tolerance as we mean it today, which means a kind of embrace of difference, an interest in difference. This is something that the Dutch were not so good at. In this respect, maybe not so different from other populations of that time, but maybe in some respects then also not much better. Now, of course, there were in Dutch history ways forward past a greater acceptance. The Enlightenment opened up a new interest, a new curiosity for people who thought and believed differently. This is an engraving from the French-Dutch illustrator Bernard Picard, and he essentially was interested in cataloging the various kinds of religions across the world. And here are the dervishes who are dancing. And the idea here is not to make them ridiculous, but it's essentially to treat them with a kind of sympathetic curiosity. What are their ways of practicing religion? And this is something that in fact shows a shifting mentality, a new interest in different peoples, different religions that start emerging in the Netherlands in the 18th century in particular. And of course, you see also that a modern parliamentary system also ends the need to be tolerant in the sense of forbearance, of essentially not using arms against others. Because it says all citizens are equal. Regardless of whether they are Protestants or Catholics or Jews, they are all equal in this country under law as of 1796. Made possible, might add, by French invasion, that the Patriots then were able to enact this legislation, but nevertheless it became a Dutch revolution, enacted in a way that fundamentally changed the way the Dutch go about dealing with each other and recognizing each other's rights. So in that sense, 1796 and its legacy is very important to essentially creating an equal playing field for everybody in Dutch society. Not immediately attained in practice, but laying the groundwork for it. And you could even argue that verzuiling, pillarization, created its own way toward greater tolerance. It essentially said, even though people lived apart from each other, it essentially said over time is that everybody has the same rights as I do. Just as we have a right to form our own organizations, other groups must also have that right. So there is a mentality that grows over time that says that it is acceptable also for other people to have the same rights as myself. Now, initially, when the radio was established in the 1920s, people listened to their own radio hours. They only listened, if you were Protestant, to Protestant programs, Catholics to Catholic programs. But over time, that changes. You become more acquainted with each other's cultures through media, radio, and later on, television. So in that sense, also, verzuiling is a way forward. And of course, it doesn't stop there. You can say, since the 1960s, new forms of tolerance have emerged in the Netherlands. Most famously or infamously, the coffee shops. It's often been said in a somewhat cliche, in a cliche, cultural cliche, that the coffee shops of today are really like those hidden churches of 3 or 4 centuries ago. That these are also examples of tolerance. In that sense, you could say if this is the measure of tolerance, maybe it's not going so well in the Netherlands. There were about 1,800 coffee shops once in the Netherlands about 20 years ago, and now that's down to about 650. So in that sense also changes here. But again, a problematic example, but often cited example of Dutch tolerance. So it seems Dutch moving forward. Intolerance perhaps abolished in the Netherlands. That there was a time in the 1990s where the Dutch thought, well, we really have become a tolerant society, perhaps even too tolerant society. That intolerance is primarily other people's problem. And one of the most striking public actions in the 1990s, maybe some of you participated in it, is you could send a postcard to German authorities saying that you were woedend, which means that you were outraged by what you saw happening in Germany, when in fact 5 Turkish people were burned to death as a result of racist actions by some extreme rightist Germans. And this was essentially also a way of saying we, as a Dutch people, are outraged about what happens across the border. 1.5 million Dutch people sent in such a card. So it was a massive action. Laudable in many ways, concerns about racism, but perhaps in other ways a kind of an indication that the Dutch were less concerned about forms of racism that were occurring in their own country. Even as this, at this very time in the 1990s, was growing. New forms of hostility took hold also in the Netherlands. Migration made the Dutch uneasy. New people coming in, new mores, new values, so it seems at least, and how do we deal with this tide of immigration? Very, very serious challenge to many parts of Dutch society. And of course, Islam became the focus point, and I don't think that's a point that I need to belabor here. Islam became the focus point of this growing concern about how, in fact, Dutch society was developing, and that Islam was essentially a threat to that. Made, you can say emblematic by the largest mosque in the Netherlands, the Islam Mosque in Rotterdam. This was strengthened by other kinds of concerns. Are the Dutch losing control? National community under pressure. Maybe, in fact, the Dutch are losing out when it comes to globalization. China, but also the expansion of the European Union, all indications the Dutch maybe are no longer masters of riding the wave of globalization, but maybe, in fact, they are losing and being crushed by that wave of globalization. Concerns about that also manifest in the Netherlands in numerous kinds of ways. A national community under pressure. And strengthening that feel was also the feeling that maybe the Dutch, in fact, no longer had the social capital necessary to essentially have a good society, maintain a good society with each other. This, of course, is a reference to the korte lontjes that you then are apparently able to see on the roadways. And one of the things that is, in fact, striking about the Netherlands, when you take a look at polls that are done, that for years the Dutch have indicated as the number one problem, not in every poll, but these are polls held every 3 months, but in far away the most polls, the number one problem the Dutch see with society is the lack of respect and consideration people have for each other. That's the number one problem. There is no European public that remotely comes in the neighborhood of this concern that the Dutch have. There are all other kinds of concerns, often economic concerns, but the Dutch concerned about, is there enough respect for each other in society? Now, some people would say that's an indication that there's really absolutely nothing wrong with Dutch society if this is their number one concern. But it seems that my point here would simply be is that it shows a fundamental unease about the quality of society the Dutch have with each other. And maybe you can say, yeah, this lack of respect is reflected in some ways with a kind of indifference and ignorance of what's going on in Dutch society, concern to do something about it. There is a study from 2010 showing that 14 and 15-year-olds in the Netherlands, that they score low in knowledge of political systems and interest in it. That about 24% of Dutch children surveyed at this age have a sufficient knowledge of the political structures of their own society. Compare this to Denmark or Finland, where the rates are at something like 55 to 60%. So the Dutch score low in that. And maybe more, I think, a greater point of concern perhaps is the second point, is that they, along with the Flemings, so the people in Dutch-speaking Belgium, react most negatively to this assertion. De kinderen van immigranten zouden dezelfde mogelijkheden moeten hebben om onderwijs te volgen als andere kinderen in het land. So they disagree the most of all 40 countries surveyed with this assertion, along with the Flemings. Now there are in fact questions about how representative this study was and whether in fact all the inputs were there for a sufficiently scientific and scholarly foundation for these assertions. But this is reflected at least, I think it reflects at least partially the reality that we now see. And we see this, I think, tied in with broader public sentiments. We see that there is, in fact, a chronic discontent that we see in Dutch society, kind of sentiments that are not just evident in the Netherlands, but also other parts of Europe and indeed other parts of the West more generally. And it seems to me this is likely to stay. We, in fact, have a kind of discontent against authority, discontent against the structures, and in fact we are being overrun by processes over which we have no control, and that we also have authorities, leadership that is unwilling to do enough about it. And one of the things that is striking, also when you talk to people in Brussels, is this new, seemingly anti-European Union stance of the Dutch. The Dutch could historically be counted for being one of the most pro-European, but certainly in much of the last decade that has changed, and in recent years that has intensified that anti-European Union stance that we see in the Netherlands. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. The religious and ethnic differences as an underlying point of tension seems to me is also something that we continue to see and will continue to see in the Netherlands. This is something that the Dutch still have to come to terms with collectively together on this point. And one of the things that has been emphasized most recently and has for many, many years essentially been discounted as unimportant in Dutch society are the growing class differences. The people who are less well educated in the Netherlands have dramatically different expectations about the future than people who are well educated or more highly educated in the Netherlands. That this is a growing divide. One of them, the first group, having many very, very negative expectations about the future, and people who are more highly educated having more positive. Very different expectations. We're seeing also, in fact, even a growing divide between life expectancy between these two groups, that by the first group lives 7 years less long than the second group. But we see this also in terms of cultural expectations, chances for participation, all kinds of ways. We're talking about a growing class divide in the Netherlands. We're also talking, certainly also in cities like Amsterdam, of a growing segregation where people who are like-minded or have the same ethnic background are increasingly living in the same neighborhoods. Amsterdam is not becoming more integrated as a city, it's becoming more segregated as a city. And that is obviously, seems to me, a cause for concern. Segregation in itself doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but it does raise questions about how and where people do come into contact with each other. And yet you see here, this is a time when it does matter that we have citizens also in this country that do come into contact with each other. More and more, we are in fact being told by the government that we in fact have to do more together. We live, as they tell us, in a participatie samenleving. And so that means that we really in fact have to take care of more things ourselves, that the government, the state, cannot do all the tasks that it has done, and we need to be in contact with each other to make these things happen. So it matters, perhaps more than ever, that we do make these bridges, that we do make these connections. Now, happily, I do think that there are strengths in Dutch society. The citizenry has remarkable strengths, and this is something that I say as an American who's lived here for 10 years that I've come to appreciate and value. I do think the Dutch, more than certainly Americans, are aware of the dangers of violent confrontations. There is, in fact, a rising sphere of polarization in the Netherlands, but how far that may go and must go, there is, I think, always a sense of limits in Dutch society because they are aware of the dangers of it. The sense of solidarity, of sharing a nation, sharing a society, and therefore having shared responsibilities strikes me still as being reasonably strong. And also what we see is that Dutch citizens, more than many other European publics, are willing to take on new challenges to help people in need. This is a society that historically has shown very high percentages compared to other countries of volunteerism, that is to say, of spending time helping others for no financial compensation, and that is a tradition that continues to persist into current times. You see new initiatives taking place every week, hundreds of new initiatives essentially developed by people in particular neighborhoods, in particular cities, who want to jump in and make things better. And it's heartwarming to see how good the Dutch are at that. In many respects, the Dutch are truly an open society. Use, it seems to be, at least at the professional level, certainly at the level at which you are, of inviting people from abroad. They are good at languages, and strikingly so. One of the things that I found really interesting is the Dutch are not just good at English, but they are also good at other languages. And this is something that a 2012 study showed. And they do this better than the Swedes, who are also good at English, for example. The Dutch really are good at languages, and it is a well-educated society as a whole, thanks to the infrastructure that is available here. But of course, much depends on the kind of education offered. And I think that is something that we, and you certainly, need to further reflect on, although I know there have been years of reflection about how you can optimally do this. Interaction seems to be central. Difference has to be taken seriously. That's to say, some of the ways in which I think people tend to deal with differences to say differences are irrelevant, we will simply not talk about them, pretend as if they're not there, and we will move forward. Difference must be taken seriously, interacted with it through critical discussion, but always in the hope that new insights and vistas will come forward. It seems to me this is the kind of formation that is central also to making the kinds of bridges that are necessary. Taking difference seriously, interacting with it, but always with the hope that, in fact, bridges can be built. The Grand Tour offered here has expanded. I understand that this map suggests you have more localities than you actually do. But this is kind of vision for the future, you can say, right? That the mission of the Grand Tour has changed. That is to say, we really do have a situation in which in fact, we have a different setting. In the first place, the Grand Tour is democratized. That's already been referred to also by the Raad van Bestuur, that there is, in fact, a different situation. We're not talking about an elite, and we're talking about a large subsection of society. And the second thing, of course, is the mission has grown. It's also about making connections. It's not about keeping a particular class in place, but it's about reaching out economically, politically, culturally, to essentially make the links that, in fact, can make this world a better place. It seems to me that's vital for the time ahead. It means that, in short, education is cosmopolitan in orientation, yet sometimes cosmopolitan can mean we are essentially creating our own elite above the fray of particular cultures, but is sensitive to particular cultures and interacts with them. It's not a place above it, but in interaction with it, it seems to me, and democratic in its aspirations and ethos. Very, very important in a time where democracy and also the key fundamentals of liberal democratic practice are in discussion. That's certainly true. You see this in other parts of the world, but also if you think about those 14 and 15-year-olds in the Netherlands and the rights they are willing to concede others, this is something that really needs to be emphasized. rights for all, as well, of course, as an eye for popular sovereignty. This education is of critical importance, not just in general, but also for what happens for the future of tolerance in this country. Thanks for listening.